In a gray, sterile prison room, Chris Watts sits under fluorescent light, his voice calm, his face almost unreadable. No emotion, no breaking tears, just a sentence that freezes the air. "They were my life," he says softly. Then comes the pause, a silence so heavy it feels like the walls themselves are listening. "It was my biggest mistake." For most fathers, those words would never belong in the same breath. To claim your children were your life, only to admit you took that very life from them, it is a contradiction so monstrous it chills the soul. This was the prison interview that changed everything about Chris Watts. Up until that moment, the world already knew him as a murderer, the man who killed his pregnant wife, Shanann, and their two young daughters, Bella and Celeste. But when he sat down inside a Colorado prison cell and began to speak, something darker came into focus. This was not just a confession of crimes. It was a glimpse into a mind that had betrayed its own blood, a father who could describe his family as his life, and in the same breath call their murder a mistake, as though it were an error in judgment, a wrong turn on the road. And so, the question that haunts this case is not simply why Chris Watts killed, but what did those words really mean? Was it remorse, rising too late from the ashes of his destruction? Or was it manipulation, a final attempt to rewrite the story, to cast himself not only as the villain, but as the grieving man who wished he could undo what he had done? The world would never see him the same way again. But to understand why this interview carried such devastating weight, we must step back. We must see the image Chris Watts built, the mask he wore, and the reality he destroyed. Because before he was the man in the prison jumpsuit, before he was the subject of documentaries, podcasts, and endless speculation, he was something else. A husband, a father, a neighbor who smiled in the driveway and waved at passing cars. The Watts family, from the outside, seemed complete. A neatly kept Colorado home. Two little girls whose laughter filled their rooms. A wife who worked tirelessly to provide, sharing the highlights of her life on social media. And Chris himself, the quiet, unassuming man, often described as shy, dependable, and steady. But perfection, especially in suburbia, is often a performance. Behind closed doors, the pressures of marriage, money, and responsibility were tightening around Chris Watts. And as Shanann's pregnancy progressed, instead of embracing fatherhood again, he began to drift further away. Toward another woman. Toward another life. Toward the secret that would ultimately consume them all. Yet, even in the wake of his unthinkable crimes, the words he later chose in that prison interview were the final blow. To call his family his life, only after extinguishing that very life, was more than hypocrisy. It was cruelty dressed as confession. The Watts case had already horrified the nation, but after this interview, the story no longer belonged only to headlines and courtrooms. It belonged to memory, to the haunting echo of a man who murdered his wife and children, then sat down and called it his biggest mistake. This is the story of that interview. The story of the life Chris Watts destroyed, the lies he told, the crimes he committed, and the words that revealed more than he ever intended. Because once those words were spoken, the illusion was gone forever. On the surface, the Watts family looked like the embodiment of the American dream. Their home stood neatly on a quiet street in Frederick, Colorado, where the lawns stayed trimmed, the neighbors waved, and life seemed steady. Chris Watts appeared to be the kind of man who lived without complications. He kept to himself, reserved but friendly enough, someone you could trust to lend a tool or help with a car engine. Shanann, his wife, filled in all the spaces he left quiet. She was outgoing, vibrant, a woman who documented her life in smiling photos and cheerful updates. To their friends and family, they seemed solid. They had two young daughters, Bella and Celeste, who lit up every room they entered. Shanann often posted videos of them online, Bella's soft singing, Celeste's giggles, moments of birthdays and bedtime kisses. Their images became etched into the public memory long before tragedy struck. The Watts family was not anonymous. They were a picture of life many aspired to: love, stability, the promise of a growing family. But behind the polished images and Facebook posts, pressure weighed heavily. Shannon worked tirelessly in sales, often traveling, juggling motherhood and career. She spoke openly about health struggles and about building a secure future. Chris, meanwhile, drifted into the role of the quiet partner. He was seen mowing the lawn, caring for the girls, seemingly happy to let Shannon steer the energy of the family. Yet there were cracks no filter could hide. Financial struggles had mounted. The couple filed for bankruptcy years earlier, and while they were trying to recover, the shadow of debt never left. Arguments simmered behind closed doors, whispered phone calls, moments Shannon shared with close friends when she felt alone in the marriage. Still, outwardly, they pressed forward. Shannon was pregnant again, this time with a boy she hoped would complete their family. She had chosen a name, Nico, and shared the news with Chris in a video that the world would later watch in horror, knowing what lay ahead. Her joy was real, her belief in her family unshaken. She spoke of her husband as her partner, the man she loved, the father she believed her children adored. But Chris was changing. Subtle at first. A new focus on his body, more hours at the gym, a distance that Shannon could sense even as she tried to hold the family together. The photos still showed smiles, but underneath was a widening gap. The neighbors, the friends, the digital audience watching from afar, none of them could have guessed that the man who posed with his wife and children in those family portraits would one day be the very reason they were gone. Because the perfect family image was not a shield. It was a mask. And Chris Watts wore it well enough that even those closest to him failed to see the storm rising beneath the surface. Every crime has a turning point. A moment when ordinary life, however strained, begins to fracture into something darker. For Chris Watts, that moment came when another woman entered his orbit. Her name was Nicole Kessinger. She was a co-worker at Anadarko Petroleum, the same oil company where Chris worked. To her, Chris was not the quiet, married father weighed down by family responsibility. He was attentive, interested, and increasingly available. Their connection sparked quickly, fueled by secrecy, by the thrill of something forbidden. It began innocently, casual conversations, shared moments at work. But soon, the walls of his double life closed in. While Shannon was away on business trips, Chris was with Nicole. While his daughters asked for bedtime stories, he was texting a new lover. The affair grew in intensity, each encounter tightening its hold on him. And with that affair came transformation. Chris, once passive and subdued, became energized. He worked out obsessively, reshaped his body, tried to become the man Nicole seemed to admire. His friends and family noticed the change. He looked different, acted different, as if he was shedding the skin of the man he had been for years. But with every lie he told Shannon, every secret he guarded, the weight of the double life grew heavier. He stood at a crossroads between two worlds, the reality of his wife, his children, and the responsibilities of fatherhood, and the fantasy of escape, of passion, of starting over. Shannon, perceptive and protective, sensed the distance. She confided to friends that something was wrong. The husband she once knew seemed absent even when he was in the same room. He avoided her touch, deflected her questions, retreated into silence. By the summer of 2018, the affair was no longer a hidden spark, it was a consuming fire. Chris talked to Nicole about a future together. About freedom. About what life might look like without the weight of his family. Words spoken in private that carried devastating consequences in reality. It is here, in the shadows of betrayal, that the fate of Shannon, Bella, Celeste, and unborn baby Nico was sealed. Because for Chris Watts, the perfect family image was no longer enough. He was building a new image, one that erased the life he had promised to protect. And as the affair deepened, so did his resolve. He was no longer a man caught between two worlds. He was a man preparing to choose. By the summer of 2018, the mask was slipping. Shannon, once so confident in her marriage, began to feel the cracks deepening. She had sensed Chris growing cold, distant, almost unreachable. Every effort she made to close the gap seemed to widen it. Her pregnancy, which should have been a celebration, became a dividing line. Shannon envisioned a future with their son, Nico, a boy who would join his sisters and complete the family she had fought so hard to build. She posted videos of her excitement, messages filled with hope. But Chris barely reacted. Instead of joy, he gave silence. Instead of pride, he gave indifference. Those who knew Shannon could see her struggle. She reached out to friends, confiding that Chris seemed different. She questioned whether he still loved her, whether the life they had built together meant anything anymore. Her words carried both fear and determination. She was not one to give up easily, but she knew something was terribly wrong. For Chris, the double life had become unbearable. At home, he was the father, the husband, the steady presence. With Nicole, he was free, unburdened, and alive. The contradiction consumed him. Every time Shannon reminded him of their future, the baby boy on the way, the responsibilities of family life, it clashed with the fantasy he was building in secret. The tension finally reached a breaking point in July 2018. During a trip with her daughters to visit family, Shannon texted Chris, pleading for reassurance. He responded with cold detachment. When she confronted him about the distance, his words stung, "I don't feel the same about us anymore." For Shannon, it was devastating. For Chris, it was a small glimpse of the future he was already planning without her. By August, Shannon's fears had sharpened into certainty. She told friends she believed Chris was pulling away, perhaps even seeing someone else. She resolved to fight for her marriage, to save her family. But Chris was already gone in his mind. He had crossed a line in thought, if not yet in action. Every glance, every silence, every unanswered question added to the storm. Shannon's love and suspicion collided with Chris' detachment and lies. The house in Frederick, Colorado, which once held laughter and family rituals, now simmered with unspoken conflict. And on the night of August 12, when Shannon returned from a business trip, the tension finally exploded. She walked through the front door close to 2 a.m., tired, pregnant, determined to confront the man she thought she still knew. But what awaited her was not reconciliation. It was the breaking point. The final hours of Shannon's life had begun. August 13 was not just a date on a calendar. It was the culmination of months of lies, fantasies, and growing detachment. For Chris Watts, the night did not come as a sudden snap of rage, it came as the quiet execution of a decision already made in his mind. Family annihilators often act in chaos, driven by despair or sudden fury. But Chris was different. He moved with a chilling calmness. Shannon returned from her business trip, exhausted, carrying not only her luggage but the weight of suspicion she had felt for weeks. Her friends later recalled the unease in her voice, her certainty that Chris was slipping away. She was right, but she could never have imagined just how far he was willing to go. What unfolded in the early hours of that morning was not only a confrontation but a test of Chris's double life. In one world, he was the family man, husband, father, provider. In the other, he was already gone, chasing the fantasy of freedom with his mistress. That night, those two worlds collided. And Chris made his choice. It is tempting to describe what he did in detail, to linger on the sequence of events. But what matters more is what it revealed, a man who could erase not just his wife, but the children who trusted him completely. A man who could silence voices calling him daddy, voices filled with love, with fear, with innocence. What sets Chris Watts apart is not only that he murdered, but how he behaved in the aftermath. He was methodical. He thought about disposal, concealment, the logistics of erasing the lives he had taken. He loaded bodies into his truck with the same mechanical efficiency he applied to his job. He drove his daughters to the oil site not in a panic, but with a terrifying normalcy. That calmness is perhaps the most disturbing part of this case, not just that he killed, but that he moved forward as if it were a task to complete. Psychologists later pointed out something chilling. Chris did not fit neatly into the category of a desperate man who snapped. He fit into the category of the cold planner, a man willing to destroy the very people closest to him to pursue a new life. His crime was not a break from reality but a decision that aligned perfectly with his desires. In his mind, the family he once called his life had become an obstacle. And on that night, he removed it. By dawn, the house in Frederick stood silent. To the neighbors, it looked the same. To the outside world, life appeared ordinary. But inside, something irreversible had happened. A family had been extinguished, and the man responsible was already thinking about the lie he would tell to cover it. The night of August 13th was not chaos. It was cold. It was calculated. And it left behind a silence that even now, years later, feels unbearable. When most people imagine murder, they think of chaos, panic, mistakes, a desperate attempt to hide what cannot be hidden. But Chris Watts did not stumble through August 13th like a man caught in frenzy. He moved with control. With precision. With the terrifying discipline of someone who had already accepted his decision. After erasing his family, Chris did not collapse in grief or shock. He carried Shanann's body, lifted his daughters, and placed them into the back of his truck with the same mechanical efficiency that he applied to every other task in his life. He thought about where to drive, where to bury, how to conceal. These were not the choices of a man in despair. They were the choices of a man who believed concealment was possible, who believed a lie could still hold. And then came the calmness. He drove to the oil site where he worked, a place familiar, routine, industrial. There, he carried out the disposal of his family with quiet method. Shanann into a shallow grave. Bella and Celeste into oil tanks. His unborn son erased before his life began. What stands out is not just the brutality of the act, but the way Chris folded it into his ordinary life. When the sun rose, he went to work. He exchanged texts. He answered calls. He even spoke with friends as though nothing had happened. The cover-up was not just about hiding bodies. It was about maintaining the illusion of normalcy. Psychologists call this compartmentalization, the ability to separate one's actions from one's identity. To the outside world, Chris was still the husband whose wife was missing. To himself, he was the man who believed he had solved the problem of his double life. In his mind, Shanann, Bella, and Celeste were no longer obstacles to his new beginning. They were gone, and with them, the responsibility he no longer wanted to bear. This is what makes the cover-up so disturbing. It was not frantic. It was not sloppy. It was ordinary. Chris Watts walked into his workplace that day with the weight of unspeakable crimes behind him. And yet he carried himself like any other Monday. The banality of his behavior, the sheer normalcy, makes his actions even more monstrous. When investigators later pieced together his movements, they did not see a man unraveling. They saw a man who had tried to blend the unimaginable into the everyday. He thought his lies would hold. He thought the story of a missing wife and children might convince the world. And for a brief moment, it almost did. But lies, like shallow graves, never last. When Shanann's friend reported her missing, Chris Watts stepped into a new role, not as the grieving husband he should have been, but as the actor in his own performance. His wife and daughters were gone because of him, but to the outside world, he presented himself as the worried father, the husband desperate for answers. He stood before cameras, his voice calm, his words rehearsed. He asked for their return, pleaded for help, spoke about wanting his family back. To those watching, something felt wrong. His body language was stiff, his eyes shifting, his tone flat. It was as though he was reading lines written by someone else, lines meant to convince, but failing under the weight of truth. The lie Chris tried to sell was simple: Shanann had taken the children and disappeared. It was a story thin enough to unravel quickly, but for Chris, it was the only version he could cling to. He thought his quiet demeanor, his history as the nice guy, would shield him. He thought no one would see through the cracks. But manipulation has a way of revealing itself. He over-explained small details, avoided direct answers, and maintained a composure too calm for the crisis he claimed to face. Investigators noticed. Friends noticed. Even the public, watching clips of his interviews, sensed the performance. What Chris underestimated was the persistence of truth. His neighbors had cameras. His co-workers noticed his behavior. Investigators, trained to hear what was not being said, began pulling apart his words. And soon, the image of the desperate husband began to collapse. Psychologists studying the case point to these interviews as a key insight into Chris Watts' mind. He did not just kill his family, he believed, even afterward, that he could control the narrative. He believed lies could replace reality. This is the mark of a manipulator, not the ability to create a perfect story, but the belief that people will accept even an imperfect one if delivered with confidence. And yet, for Chris, confidence was the one thing he lacked. His lies betrayed him not because the story was weak, but because his performance could not hide the emptiness inside. He was not convincing because he did not feel the loss. The mask he had worn for years had finally cracked, and the world was watching. The lie he tried to sell was never about saving his family. It was about saving himself. But even in that, he failed. Months after the murders, when the cameras had dimmed and the trial was over, Chris Watts sat inside a Colorado prison and spoke again. No longer the man on the driveway giving stiff interviews, no longer the defendant in court, now he was simply inmate number 674897, locked away with nothing left to hide. But what he said behind those walls would shock the world more than his courtroom confession. Because it was here, in the sterile quiet of a prison interview, that Chris uttered the words that changed everything. They were my life. It was my biggest mistake. To most, the statement read as remorse. To others, it was something far more disturbing, a man rewriting the story of his crimes in language that dulled their brutality. Think about the choice of words, they were my life. A declaration of love, spoken only after destroying the very people he claimed to cherish. Then, the phrase that follows, my biggest mistake. Not, my greatest evil, not, my unforgivable act. He reduced the annihilation of his pregnant wife and 2 daughters to the language of a miscalculation, as though he had made a wrong turn, missed a payment, or signed the wrong form. This is where the prison interview reveals its darkest truth. Chris Watts was not only confessing, he was reframing. His words blurred the line between guilt and excuse, painting himself not as a monster, but as a man who had simply failed, who had made a mistake. Psychologists who studied his interview noted the absence of language that took full ownership. He spoke of the murders in detached tones, describing events as though they had happened to someone else. He avoided raw emotion. He avoided the word choice. And yet, every act he committed on that August night was a choice. The prison interview became a mirror reflecting his contradictions. On one hand, he acknowledged Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and unborn Nico as his life. On the other, he confessed to ending that life, stripping it away not in a moment of madness but through deliberate action. The contradiction is not just chilling, it is central to understanding Chris Watts. He wanted to be seen as both the grieving father and the killer, the man who regretted but the man who also justified. For true crime audiences, those words struck like a lightning bolt. They forced a question no one could escape: was Chris Watts truly remorseful, or was this another performance, a new story told from behind bars to make himself appear more human, more forgivable? The more you listen, the more it feels like manipulation. A subtle rewriting of history, a bid for sympathy, an attempt to shift from murderer to tragic figure. But his calmness, his lack of true emotion, betrays him. Because remorse speaks with rawness. Regret shakes the voice. Chris Watts spoke with the same detachment he had shown all along. In that moment, the world realized something terrifying: Chris Watts was not only capable of annihilating his family. He was capable of narrating their deaths in words that sounded almost ordinary. And that is why the prison interview changed everything. It did not just confirm his guilt, it revealed the chilling vacancy behind it. Words carry weight. They can heal, they can wound, they can define a legacy long after a person is gone. For Chris Watts, it was not the act of murder alone that left the world stunned. It was the words he chose afterward. They were my life, it was my biggest mistake. To anyone hearing those words, there is a natural impulse to lean in, to search for the crack of remorse, to hope for even a shred of humanity. But what makes this statement unforgettable is that it does the opposite. It reveals a distortion so profound that it almost defies comprehension. Think of the word life. To a father, life means the heartbeat of children, the laughter in the kitchen, the small arms wrapping around his neck at night. By saying his family was his life, Chris was invoking an image of devotion, while sitting in prison for annihilating the very people who gave that life meaning. It is not only a contradiction. It is a desecration of the word itself. Then comes the phrase biggest mistake. This is the language of accidents, of missteps. You forget an anniversary. You miss a deadline. You buy the wrong car. A mistake is something you can learn from, correct, perhaps even forgive. But the deliberate erasure of a wife, 2 daughters, and an unborn son is not a mistake. It is an atrocity. By calling it a mistake, Chris Watts reduced the horror to the level of inconvenience, a linguistic trick that allowed him to soften the truth even as he spoke it. Psychologists call this minimization. It is a defense mechanism used by offenders to shrink the moral size of their crimes. Instead of calling it what it was, murder, Chris chose a word that made it sound almost like an error in judgment. It was not a slip of the tongue. It was a pattern, consistent with how he spoke throughout his interviews. He admitted without admitting, confessed without taking full ownership, spoke without ever using words that matched the gravity of his actions. That is why these words still echo. Not because they revealed regret, but because they revealed the absence of it. They showed a man who wanted to be seen as repentant while still controlling the narrative. A man who could call the destruction of his family both his life and his mistake, weaving contradictions into a performance that fooled no one. For true crime history, this moment stands as a turning point. It was not just another prison confession. It was a father who spoke the wrong words, words that stripped away the possibility of sympathy and left only the chilling realization that even in admitting guilt, Chris Watts was still manipulating, still minimizing, still controlling. And in the silence after those words, the question lingers, what does it mean when a father can speak of love and annihilation in the same breath? The murders of Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and unborn Nico could have faded into history as another horrific crime. But they didn't. Instead, the Watts case became one of the most dissected, analyzed, and endlessly rewatched stories in true crime history. Documentaries, podcasts, YouTube channels, and entire online communities have devoted themselves to unraveling every word, every gesture, every silence. Why? Part of the answer lies in the contradiction Chris Watts embodied. He was not the stereotypical villain, no criminal record, no violent past, no visible instability. He was the quiet neighbor, the good guy who smiled at barbecues and played with his daughters on the front lawn. He was the man who looked ordinary, and that is exactly what makes him terrifying. If Chris Watts could erase his family, then perhaps anyone could. Evil, in his case, didn't come with warning signs. It came with a friendly face in a suburban neighborhood. But the deeper reason for public obsession rests on the prison interview. Those words, "They were my life, it was my biggest mistake," became a kind of cultural riddle. Were they an expression of regret? Or were they another manipulation? Viewers listened and re-listened, debating tone, body language, choice of words. Psychologists weighed in, criminologists dissected it, ordinary people on forums argued late into the night. The fascination wasn't just with the crime itself, it was with the way Chris Watts continued to control the narrative even behind bars. There is also something uniquely haunting about the fact that Shanann herself left behind a digital legacy. Her social media posts, her videos with Bella and Celeste, her pregnancy announcement, all of it remains preserved online, replayed against the backdrop of Chris's prison interview. Audiences can watch the smiles, hear the laughter, see the love, and then contrast it with the man who sat in prison and reduced it all to a mistake. That collision of innocence and annihilation keeps the case alive in the public mind. The What story became more than a crime. It became a mirror. It forced people to confront questions about trust, about the masks people wear, about how well we can ever truly know the ones closest to us. And Chris's words, spoken with calm detachment, turned those questions into obsessions. People return to this case not because they want to know what happened, that is already clear. They return because they are still trying to understand how a man could speak those words at all. When crimes like this dominate headlines, there is always a danger that the killer overshadows the victims. His lies, his interviews, his manipulations, they become the focus. But the story of Chris Watts is not truly his. It belongs to Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico. Their lives were more than the way they ended. Shanann was 34, a woman who had fought her whole life to create stability out of struggle. She grew up in North Carolina, worked tirelessly in health and wellness, and built a career that allowed her to support her family with pride. She was outspoken, driven, resilient, someone who refused to settle for less than the life she wanted. Her friends remember her laughter, her determination, her deep love for her children. Even in her moments of doubt about her marriage, Shanann clung to hope, always believing she could hold her family together. Bella was just 4 years old. Gentle, sweet, with a voice that carried in song. Videos show her shyly singing nursery rhymes, wrapping her arms around her mother's neck, looking out for her younger sister with the tenderness only a firstborn knows. She had dreams that would never be lived, a personality just beginning to bloom. Celeste, known as Cece, was 3. She was the spark of energy, mischievous, bold, the one who filled rooms with her laughter. She clung to her father with innocent devotion, never knowing that the trust she placed in him would be betrayed in the most unimaginable way. And then there was Nico, unborn, but already loved. Shanann had chosen his name, dreamed of his future, spoken of him with joy. He never drew his first breath, but his existence mattered. His name, too, stands as part of the family destroyed. Together, they were not statistics or headlines. They were a family, a mother, 2 daughters, a son. Their legacy is not the crime, but the life they built in small, ordinary moments. Birthday parties. Bedtime stories. Trips with friends. A mother's pride posted online for the world to see. These are the memories that endure. Shanann's family has fought to preserve that legacy. They remind the world of her strength, of the children's joy, of the love that was real and alive before it was stolen. In the courtroom, in interviews, and in the years since, they have insisted that the story of Chris Watts is not about him, but about them, the victims who deserve to be remembered not for how they died, but for how they lived. And that, perhaps, is the final tragedy of Chris Watts' words. By calling his family his life only after destroying them, he tried to make himself part of their story. But the truth is, they are the story. Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico, they are the ones whose lives deserve to be carried forward. Their legacy is love. Their legacy is resilience. And their names will outlive the man who tried to erase them. In the end, all that remains are words. Chris Watts' actions destroyed a family, but his words in prison left the world with something else, a riddle, a wound that refuses to heal. They were my life, it was my biggest mistake. For some, those words sounded like remorse. For others, they were a final act of manipulation, a way of softening the truth with language that fell short of reality. But for everyone who heard them, they became unforgettable. Because they were spoken by a man who had obliterated the very life he claimed to treasure. The power of those words is not in what they reveal, but in what they conceal. They reveal a man who wanted to appear human, capable of regret. They conceal the brutality of choice, the cold calculation of murder, the extinguishing of innocence. They blur the line between confession and performance, leaving us uncertain if we are listening to a man broken by guilt, or a man still trying to control the story even from behind bars. And yet, in the silence after those words, the truth is clear. Shannon, Bella, Celeste, and Nico were not a mistake. They were not obstacles. They were lives, vibrant, fragile, irreplaceable. Chris Watts' words may continue to echo, but their names are louder. This is why the prison interview changed everything. It forced us to confront the chilling reality that evil does not always come with rage or madness. Sometimes it comes with calmness. With quiet smiles. With ordinary words spoken by an ordinary man who chose to annihilate his own family. The Watts case is more than a crime story. It is a reminder. A reminder that trust can be betrayed in the most unimaginable way. A reminder that words, no matter how carefully chosen, cannot rewrite truth. And a reminder that the voices of Shannon, Bella, Celeste, and Nico, preserved in laughter, in photographs, in memories, will always matter more than the man who silenced them. The interview left us haunted because it left us questioning, when a father can speak of love and annihilation in the same breath, what does that say about the human capacity for deception, for denial, for evil itself? Chris Watts' words changed everything. Not because they brought clarity, but because they reminded us how dangerous a lie can sound when it is wrapped in the language of love.